Hello, this is Deborah Clay, author of The Borrowed Boy and Just Be, and presenter of Castaway Books. Each week I invite an author to tell me about the books that have inspired their life and influenced their writing. This week's guest is Marian Thorpe. I'm delighted to welcome Marian Thorpe to my Castaway Island today because Marian is another of my Friday Salon regulars. And if you haven't watched it, it's the Friday Salon is a weekly tweet chat that we have. And it's an absolute delight for me to meet people that I chat with every week. So thank you, Marian.
And for me to meet you too. That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. And the timing's great because your sixth book in the Empire series, the very popular Empire series, was published just recently on the 30th of August. So perfect timing.
Yes, lovely.
So congratulations on that. And I know that the books are very popular. So if anybody hasn't read them, go to the link after the show and you can find out all about the Empire's are they called the Empire's Air books or Empire's Legacy?
Empire's Legacy is the overall title.
Yeah, which is a mixture of historical and fantasy, because you correct me, but I think that you were saying that it is set in a fantasy world based on historical
Yes.
world.
Yeah, the geography and history resembles that of Northern Europe. It isn't. There are some significant differences in the geography and also in the history and the social structure, but it's non-magical fantasy, and there is no magic. It's simply a different society that's evolved in a very different way, essentially after the decline of Rome. So it's very hard to classify into a genre.
Interesting concept. I'm sure we'll find out more about it as you talk through your book choices.
Yeah, I think so.
Shall we start with your first book?
Yes, my first book, Enid Blyton. Now I've forgotten his title, The Caravan Children, I think.
The Caravan Family.
The Caravan Family, thank you. Yes, I don't even know where the book came from in our house. I'm assuming one of my English aunts sent it to me. Just for a little background for whoever's listening, I'm a dual British and Canadian citizen. My parents emigrated from Britain after the Second World War, along with a lot of others. And but I grew up in Canada, but with that constant sense that England was home. And when my mother said home, she meant England. She didn't mean where we lived in Canada. And all my aunts and cousins and everyone else was still in England. So they sent things at Christmas and birthdays. So I'm assuming the Enid Blyton book showed up in one of those parcels. And what I remember about it, it's been a while since I've looked at it, I don't have it anymore, was that there was a sense of, well, first of all, Blyton had a very good sense of describing the countryside. She could capture a feeling of a location or a place in a very few words, but still really evoke it. And that was interestingly, that's the first thing I remember about reading that. And then the second thing was the freedom. The gist of the story is a family, dad's returned from the war, and they're looking for housing, which they're not finding. And they've been living with the grandmother, I believe. And they end up with these two, what would have been called in the books, gypsy caravans, complete with pony or ponies. And they travel around southern, I think it's probably Kent and Sussex, if I think about it, for the summer before finally finding a place to live. And just the sheer freedom of that, the ability to travel those lanes and walk the footpaths, and the adventures a little bit that they got into, just really resonated with me as a child growing up in Canada in a very odd way, because it tied in so well to the stories that I heard from my parents about their childhoods and my grandparents who lived with us too. So So it was sort of a affirmation of a reality that I didn't know.
Do you feel Canadian or British? Do you have
Both,
yeah.
both. It's very strange. I mean, I've spent up until the pandemic, after we retired, we spent every England in winter, every winter in England, and in a place that I grew up with stories about, the area that my father grew up in. So I do feel very I very much that dual citizen piece is the half of me's there and half of me's here, and we had planned to move to England actually after retirement. My husband's Scottish by same thing, parents who came right after the war. And basically we knew where we were going, we knew exactly where we were headed, and then Brexit. And we just sort of thought maybe not.
Your father, I think you said your father came from Norfolk.
Yes, that's right.
Which isn't far from me. I live in East Anglia.
Do you?
Yeah, my sister's in Norfolk, which is about an hour's drive from us, and we're on the Essex-Suffolk border. So not
right. Far. Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, we know the area around Minsmere quite well because birders. So
yeah,
the coast, the whole East Anglian coast is we know relatively well. But yes, so my father was from Dersingham, which is right outside Sandringham House.
Mm-hmm.
So that West Norfolk, right on the Wash. So that's where we have spent winters for the last number of years up until last winter. And we were actually there when the pandemic started and the message came, from the Canadian government, come home. So we did, sadly.
Yeah. Otherwise you might still be here.
Yes, we might be.
Explain to me, I haven't heard about lots of people emigrating to Canada after the Second World War. What was the motivation? Do you know why?
Well, I think it was a couple of things. Work, for one. And there were, after the Second World War, England was a pretty depressed place in many ways. The rationing was still in place well into the 50s. Jobs were not that easy to come by. And I think that a lot of people were simply looking for a fresh start somewhere else. My father, who didn't fight because his eyesight was appallingly bad, he literally probably couldn't have seen 6 inches in front of him without his glasses on. He and his parents ran a small holding in Bedford, or just outside of Bedford. So he was involved with food production anyway. They were glasshouse tomatoes and various other crops. So he probably would have been deferred, could have been deferred anyhow. But his parents were, by the time the World War was over, were, in their 70s and ready to retire. And I think he just thought this was a good time. My mother, who had served in the war, she and my father's sister were both service as in the Signals Corps. She, I think, too, I think they just wanted something different and something new. So off to Canada.
Very adventurous of them, pioneering spirit to get up and go in that era.
And leave your whole families behind. I mean, absolutely everybody. It was very brave. It's actually my mother's and my aunt's story of being soldiers, forces members in the war, which is the basis, the real basis of my first book, well, of the whole series. But it started, what I was thinking about with Empire's Daughter started with that concept of Britain drafted women in the Second World War, for the first countries to ever do so. Although they weren't going to see, frontline service, they were still drafted. I believe neither my mother I know volunteered right at the beginning, and I believe my aunts weren't either. But that whole concept of suddenly women are being asked to do something they've never been asked to do before. And basically the message coming from Churchill and others is that we cannot win this war without you. We need every man on the front lines. We need you to take these spots that otherwise, that men would have had. And that whole disruption to their life and their society was what I started thinking about. But I didn't want to write a historical novel with all the restrictions and constraints of writing a pure historical novel. So I put it in this early medieval world, and but looked at the same issue: what happens when you ask women to fight.
Interesting. I've spoken to women who have been older women now, one lady in particular, who told me that during the war she worked on planes, and she was flying planes, and she had the training as a result of the war, and the amazing things that women got the opportunity to do. And then after the war, it was right back in your box now, wasn't it? You've done your bit, back to being behind the man. Really interesting what they went through.
Yes, absolutely. And that was many places, not just Britain, because women working in munitions in North America found the same thing. But yes, I mean, some of those things, like the women who did ferry the planes, and my mother went off she was seconded to work with Supreme Headquarters Allied Forces Europe in under Eisenhower and they were stationed in Versailles. And so she probably would have never got to go to Paris and Versailles. And the other part of it was the secrets they knew. She was signals. So they were getting the encrypted messages coming in and knowing things were going to happen. Maneuvers like the one I believe that was the basis of the movie A Bridge Too Far. I can remember her telling me she knew that. She knew it was going to happen. She would never, ever talk about it for the rest of her life. She had signed the Official Secrets Act, and she had signed it for her entire life as far as she was concerned. So,
amazing. Yeah. Really strong women. Have you taken after them, do you think, as a strong, independent woman? Have you learned?
Yes, I have. The women in my family, especially my father's family, are unusual for their times. I have had in multiple generations, multiple childless working women at a time when that wasn't usual. Or either working without being with never marrying, or not formally marrying, and but also women who did marry chose, for whatever reason, biologic or otherwise, not to have children, put themselves into their careers, and rose to quite high levels. The last one of that generation, of my father's generation, is my cousin who lives in Norfolk, who is 100, and and living on her own, and she's pretty amazing. And she was a teacher, Oxford educated. She had Tolkien and Lewis as lecturers. So listening to her stories about those is just wonderful. And just so very, very strong, independent, well-educated women run in my family. My older sister has multiple degrees. She was a lawyer for a while. So yeah.
It's all a lot to live up to as well, I should think, when you're a young woman growing up.
Yeah, very much so.
Should we go on to your second book?
Yes, my second book was Lord of the Rings. And but not for the usual reasons, I don't think. I read it very young. I was 11 because it was Christmas before my 12th birthday. And my father had asked for it from my sister, who is 10 years older than I am. So she was away at university. And, it had been getting some buzz at this point. So this is what year am I thinking? This is 1970. So it had been getting some buzz, around the universities by then. And he'd heard about it and he was curious. So he asked for it. She brought it for him for Christmas. And I just started reading it. And my grandmother had taught me to read when I was 3. So I would read anything. I mean, absolutely anything. And we lived in a small farming town in southern Ontario, and it did have a decent library, but nonetheless, I would, still take out 8 or 10 books in a week and read them all and take them back. And this was between Christmas and New Year, so the library was closed. So I needed something to read. So there was Lord of the Rings. So I read it in 3 days. I can still remember that, reading it just non-stop.
Huge, that book.
Yeah. I felt pretty sick by the end of those 3 days. I can tell you, I can remember that too. That sort of, oh, I'm going to throw up if I'm not careful. But but it wasn't the magic. It was the things that pull in most people into it was, again, the sense of landscape, the sense of freedom, the travel, and that really, really strong sense of this ancient world that was there. And that's going to be a pretty common theme in all the books I chose. And it runs through my own books, that theme. And only, what would I say? One of my other major hobbies is landscape history and landscape archeology. I will say this probably, had my parents stayed in Britain, had I been born, ifs, all the ifs, I might have known that landscape archaeology was a profession. And I suspect I would have been a landscape archaeologist. Growing up in Canada, I'd never heard of it. I didn't. Time team, like for many people, was how I learned about it. And I can remember watching those, my husband would concur with this, watching those early time teams and realizing that you could be a landscape archaeologist and just saying, oh, why didn't I know that? But again, interestingly, I wouldn't have done it here because there's no real connection for me to the land here. When you look back, Canada's been settled by Europeans for a few hundred years. I have no inherent connection to Indigenous culture. So while things that are part of the landscape that are Indigenous are interesting, I don't feel any real connection to them. Whereas when we're in Britain, especially in East Anglia, but not only, I can be walking on footpaths that people from my family walked on 400 years ago, and they were walking past the same Bronze Age barrows that are there today. And there's just a much more visceral sense of connection to the land and its history. So yeah, landscape archaeology is my British hobby, not my Canadian one.
I know what you mean, though. I love that feeling of going somewhere and just imagining centuries and centuries before. For me, it's houses in particular. And I go into a medieval house. One of my favorite books is The Strand, Daphne du Maurier. I read that when I was quite young, and I always had that sense of, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could just roll back the years, the centuries, yes, and be standing here and see what it was like and who was living here all of those centuries before. And wouldn't it be magical if you could just do that? If I had a superpower, I think it would be to stand somewhere and just reel back and just watch it. not go there, just watch it, observe it.
Have you ever read Lucy Boston's Green No series?
No.
They're children's books, and they're set around a medieval house. And that actually happens in a couple of the books, where the time just sort of melts and people end up in a different era in the same house. And it happens in one of Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising series too. I think the book actually called The Dark is Rising. And yeah, it's just such a wonderful concept of saying, all right, well, I can remember my great uncle was curator of the pictures at Hampton Court Palace. And when he died, he left all his papers and memorabilia and everything to Hampton Court. Don't know why, but he did. So they have it all neatly called the Rainbow Archives, all neatly boxed away. And about 15 years ago, my sister and I went to look at it because we wanted to see what he'd had. And so we were in parts of Hampton Court Palace that the public doesn't get to see. And it was eerie. There was definitely that sense of, my God, Henry VIII walked these halls, There's this very, very strong sense of connection to history. And, you can almost hear the ghosts, right? In a way that the echoes, a marvelous experience.
I love Hampton Court.
Yeah,
Beautiful
place.
Mm. Now we move on to your third book. I get so distracted and interested in conversation. I have to keep myself on track. So we're on to your third book.
The Hollow Hills, Mary Stewart. Herein lies my first, what's the word, exposure to a Britanno-Roman culture just after the Romans leave. And I mean, I loved all of that series. But it was, again, the thing that really grabbed me in that first part of the Hollow Hills is the description of the villa and the crumbling hypocaust, and that sense of there was something here before and this is what is here now, and they are connected. There isn't this, okay, the Romans left and we became, Dark Ages peasants again. And yeah, that really got my brain started on my interest in post-Roman British history. My books owes a fair chunk to her, I think, in those books.
So what would you have been doing in your life about then? How old would you have been?
Hollow Hills, I'm guessing I read it in my 20s. So I was in university.
What were you studying? You weren't doing landscape archaeology?
No. My university was a little, well, not as bad as my husband's, but I jumped around a bit. I started a history degree and in Canadian history. And that was sort of, after a year, it was okay. Again, same, no real connection, right? No real sense of a connection to it. It was very much purely an academic subject. So it wasn't working for me. So I decided to stop and I took a year off. And then I went back, and my next two degrees, my undergraduate and graduate degree, are in agricultural science, to be complete change, right? So I can tell you all sorts of things about breeding corn, maize, and other such lovely things, which was what my father had done. So I was very much following in his footsteps in that direction, and so did my brother, actually. So it was sort of, but again, if I look at it, it was a way of connecting myself to the land and to the soil, and being outdoors, and I was, the history of agriculture was, again, my interest went that way, even though my undergraduate degree and graduate degrees are in practical plant breeding. So at the time I read the Hollow Hills, I would have been probably doing that, either directly in school or doing research, which I did after. I was a research associate for a few years afterwards, but I already never lost the interest in other parts of my life and the things that I was interested in. So, but yeah, it gets blurry, trying to remember exactly when you first read a book.
Yeah. So when did you meet your husband? In your 20s or later?
No, in my 20s. I'm in 1978, I met him. So 40th wedding anniversary this coming weekend.
Oh, congratulations.
I was a young 23. I can't believe I got married at 23 now, looking back on it.
Then we thought we were old. I got married at 24 and I thought I was old to be getting married, but young people today don't think about getting married until they're 30.
No, I know. I mean, I have a 23-year-old niece and I just look at her and I think, oh, I got married at her age. So we met at university. And again, he'd been brought up in a house with a lot of interest in history. And so we shared that interest as well as a number of others. And so we took that while we were in grad school. We took for the fun of it, we took a couple of courses in the evenings on Scottish history, one prior Scottish history up to probably the Union, I think, and then probably one afterwards. I don't remember the second one, but the first one was great. And our professor was this really young, really vibrant, great storyteller, fresh out of university himself. He probably wasn't that much older than we were, but he was such a wonderful storyteller. And he just told us all sorts of stories that had nothing to do with real history and everything to do with folk history. And so this all blended together really well at the time. and started my imagination going.
All of this has all contributed to your life as an author, hasn't it?
Absolutely, yes, yes.
So shall we go on to your fifth book?
Fourth
book. Counting four. I'm looking at it, but
The Northern Girl.
That's the one.
Okay, this is a bit of a departure from the others, not entirely, but it is. So again, one of the things, to tie this into myself as a writer, one of the things about my world and my books is that heterosexuality is not the norm, or not the only norm, shall I say. That basically all forms of sexuality are unexceptional in the world that I have written. And the first time I ever saw this written in a book where it really was simply part of the background of the world, or it was in a series called The Chronicles of Tornar by Elizabeth A. Lynn, which were published in the late 70s and early 80s. And I can remember reading those books, which are also very rooted in their landscape and in history that kind of looks like Britain, but isn't. And thinking, oh, if I ever write anything seriously that gets published, this is what this is the way I want to write the world, right? And this I would have read for the first time probably around 30. And it was the 80s, and AIDS was happening, and we had friends who were affected by it, and friends who were just coming out of the closet, and friends who were getting arrested for being gay, and a whole bunch of different things going on like that. And I guess I just really, the contrast between this world that Lynn had described, had envisioned, and the real one struck me that one of the purposes, and I still believe this strongly, is that one of the purposes of speculative fiction, whether it's science fiction or whether it's fantasy or whether it's whatever it is I write, is to show us a world where things are possible that if you presented them in a real life setting might be too challenging or too threatening to some people. But by putting them in a world that's either set in the future or in a completely different world, they are less threatening because it isn't our real world. And so you can actually back off and think, what if, what if that was like that? In a different way. It occupies a different place in your mind, I think. And that's what I wanted to do. So that's why also, the other thing is that her writing style really influenced mine too. So she writes in a way that I found very, not flowery, but not Hemingway either. So somewhere in between the two.
That's really interesting what you say about creating a world to try out different things because it's more acceptable to people than imagining in their own world. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Are there any particular, sexuality was one thing. I haven't read your books, but I will do. But was there any other areas that you particularly wanted to explore in your writing through putting it in a different world?
Really just the whole concept, as I said, of what happens to a world where women are suddenly challenged to be part of, to defend their land in a way that they haven't had to do before. Then there was the whole issue of what happens if this happens in a non-heteronormative society. And the third thing I really wanted to talk about, although it's not as challenging in a way, is there is an underlying sense of where's the balance between personal freedom and what you give up for your country. Where is that balance, right? Like between, I had a reviewer quite recently say that this was a very interesting concept given our current circumstances where people are arguing about giving up the freedom, what's the freedom of not being vaccinated or not wearing a mask and all these things versus the good of the country, right? So that was definitely one, I mean, obviously not planned for a pandemic I didn't know was coming, but just the whole concept of the individual freedom versus the public good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very topical. You don't write blogs, do you? I was going to say, make a good topic for a blog to connect
I
with.
do actually have a blog. I don't think I've ever challenged that. I've ever thought about writing that one. I tend to stay away. I tend to stay to history and non-controversial subjects.
Yeah. Okay, so we are on to your fifth book now.
And my fifth book was Tagana. Ah, yes, Tagana. Guy Gabriel Kay is a Canadian historic fantasy writer who has written about 18 books and won the World Fantasy Award and been a huge influence on me. He writes books that are very similar. Wait a minute, let's back that up. I write books that are very similar to his in the way he takes real history and twists it slightly to create a slightly different world. His books include some magic, unlike mine, but basically everything I learned about world building, about creating this not quite real world based on our own history, came from reading his books over and over and over again. So I had to choose one. And I chose Tagana because it has the same themes as mine. What will you give up for the land that you love? But the twist in Tagana, which I absolutely love, is that the wizard who conquered the land of Tagana has put a spell on it that no one can hear its name spoken. So he has effectively erased the country from history. And that's the real concept behind the book, is that is the complete loss of a country's history through you could say a colonial power. And that concept really, really interested me. So it is all his books, it is my favorite. They're all challenging concepts. None of them are simple, but that one really caught my attention. And there's a lot of other things in the books, there are some characters and groups of characters in Tagana which significantly influenced some of mine, and I knew that right from the start. I say it's a homage to him, I'm not copying, but there are things that are similar. But it really got me thinking about that whole sense of history and what is history and how easy it is to lose a country's history simply by either a colonial power purposely removing it, or simply by the loss of story and language. So all those things become part of my books as well: language, history, lost history, but in very different ways.
That's interesting, because it's not just countries. As you were talking, I was thinking about how our own histories, our family histories, our childhood, the stories that the family be passed from one to another, how important that is, the whole thing of storytelling, because it may not even be the reality of what happened. It's people's recollections of what happened, but they become the reality. Now,
that's right. Yeah.
My husband doesn't have anyone to tell him about his past because of his upbringing. He was adopted, and et cetera, et cetera. And when I ask him questions, he says, well, I don't know. I don't know because I've got no photographs. I don't know what a real memory is and what people have told me. I've got no siblings. I've got no family. So he doesn't know his history. And it just shows how important storytelling is, but also how it gets distorted as people have different recollections. I mean, have you ever been with school friends you've met up with that you haven't seen for years, and then you've compared your recollections and you see like completely different perspective on something to what you've lived with?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, as I was thinking about that only the other day, because I've been talking to my 100-year-old cousin, and she had been telling me a story about the time my sister and I took my father back to England and we went to visit her. And my recollection of how the conversation went and hers are very, very different. And, to the point where I now no longer know which one's real. Like what did happen? What was said? I don't know. She has her version, I have mine, and maybe it's somewhere in between. I should ask my sister sometime what she remembers, but yeah, family stories are so important. And as you said, it doesn't matter whether that's what really happened. That's what the family believes, and that's what some of the things that help create family is that there are shared stories.
Yeah, yeah. And it's the same for organizations too. In my work as management consultant, I'd go into an organization, and as organizations come together and merge, there's this whole thing about the history and the story and the shared experiences that you bring together, which makes the culture of the organization. Yeah. Storytelling is very powerful.
Yes, absolutely it is. One of my main characters is the equivalent of a bard, but his role is to be the history keeper and the storyteller for his culture, so that those stories are passed on to children and through song and story. And that was purposeful. I mean, there's this whole sense of passing on history and passing on story that happens. And yes, it's incredibly important. And unfortunately, too easy to get lost, I think, now in an era of families not being together and other forms of entertainment taking precedence.
Absolutely. And technology changing so quickly that you wonder if things you've captured in one, we've known videos and CDs and things, and they change and change and change without having the written longhand writing and photographs you can hold. You wonder how much will be preserved as technology changes.
That's right, because I already know people who can't access photos that they took 20, 30 years ago because they're on a media that can't be read any longer, or in a program that can't be accessed any longer. We had this huge photograph album when we still have it, but it was in his huge coal company ledger, which my grandfather had worked for the coal company for his entire working life, and then he'd collected in his retirement, I guess, all these family photos, and he only labeled about a third of them, maybe. And I can remember as a child sitting with him, and then later with my father, and going over who was who in all the pictures. But again, nobody ever wrote it down. It was all up here, right, in everybody's mind. And now, my sister and I, about 5 or 6 years ago, well, my brother before he died, we sort of realized that we were the last people who knew who these people were in these photos. And we better start writing it down because if the next generation cared or wanted to know, there wasn't going to be anybody who could tell them. And so we made a concerted effort to write it down and write down the stories and things like that go with it. But you can also see, I mean, we only have, among the three of us, my brother had 3 children. So, and they're not terribly interested, no. So you can see where these stories are going to eventually get lost anyway, which I guess is normal, but it's a little sad.
It's sad. Hopefully somebody somewhere will pick them up. So let me just ask you, how long have you been writing for? Did you always want to be an author, and when did you take yourself seriously as an author?
Well, I've always wanted to be an author. I probably wrote my first things when I was about 6 or 7. Not that they were any good, but I wrote a bit in my late teens. Well, no, that's silly. It was my late teens. I started the Great Canadian Novel when I was about 17, of which I wrote about half. But interestingly, the same theme: attachment to the land and what you will do to defend your land. And then I wrote a bit in my 20s, mostly nonfiction, a lot of nature writing. And then I got caught up in careers and didn't write until sometime in my mid-30s, I think. And I started writing poetry, which got published, and a couple of really bad novels that didn't. And then I started writing Empire's Daughter when I was about 40. And it took me 15 years to write because I was working in a demanding job. We were traveling a lot. My parents were elderly at that point and needed a lot of care on the weekends, so didn't have a lot of time. And then it was published when I was 50 something, 53 maybe. When did I start taking myself seriously? Probably when the poetry got published, actually. Once somebody else out there was validating that, yes, what I was writing was worth writing, worth publishing, worth other people seeing. So I did start taking myself more seriously then. And then basically, once Empire's Daughter was accepted by a publisher, not the publisher it's published with now, but the one that originally accepted it went out of business, unfortunately, but the rights reverted to me, so that wasn't a problem. So somewhere in that sort of 40, in my years between 40 and 50, I think I really started to take myself seriously as I do. Let's put it that way.
We can never take ourselves too seriously. It's not good. Okay, we've got through your books. So I have one last thing to ask you, and that is, what would be your luxury that you would take with you on the island?
Did I answer that? I may have changed. Oh, my binoculars.
Yes. Binoculars for your bird watching.
Right. Yes, of course it was. Yes, it was my binoculars. You're stuck in this little island somewhere. There's probably going to be lots of great birds fly by.
That's a wonderful one to have. Excellent. Yeah. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. I could go on all evening, but I'm not allowed to, because I won't have enough time to be the limited time that I can put up there. So I'll have to
thank you very much.
But it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for joining me on my island.
Thanks, Deborah. Really appreciate you having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this week's episode of Castaway Books. References for all of the books discussed in this show can be found on my website, which is www.abrakdeborah.wordpress.com. It's the letter K and then my name, Deborah, Deborah. So until next week, goodbye.